June 12, 1944. Just 6 days after D-Day, the airfields of southern England roared to life before dawn. The mission orders were simple: protect the bombers over France. Yet inside the hangars, a quiet revolution was already underway, not in the cockpits, but in the fuel drums stacked along the tarmac. The P-51 Mustangs lined up for takeoff that morning were about to fly with something entirely new in their tanks. It looked the same, smelled the same, and poured like any other fuel. But inside its molecules was a secret so potent it would tilt the balance of the air war in the Allies' favor. The pilots had no idea that what they were about to unleash wasn't just another high-octane blend. It was 150-octane aviation fuel, a liquid weapon born of chemistry, secrecy, and desperation. By the time they returned, some would swear their Mustangs climbed faster, ran cooler, and carried them further than ever before. And they were right. For the first time, Allied aircraft could match or outrun anything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. It was a small change, a new type of gasoline, but it would rewrite the story of aerial warfare. To understand why this mattered, we have to go back to the world before the invasion, to an air war that had turned grim. In 1943, the Allies were still bleeding in the skies over Europe. The daylight bombing campaign was supposed to break the German war machine by destroying its factories, oil refineries, and transport lines. But every daylight raid came at a terrible cost. B-17s and B-24s, lumbering across occupied Europe, faced swarms of German fighters that tore them apart long before reaching their targets. Escorting fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning could only protect them part of the way. Their fuel tanks simply couldn't carry them to Germany and back. Beyond 300 miles, the bombers were alone, and the Luftwaffe knew it. The result was a slaughter. In October 1943, during the infamous raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, 60 bombers failed to return in a single day. More than 600 airmen were lost. American commanders realized that without long-range escort fighters, their air offensive might collapse. The technology existed. The P-51 Mustang, sleek and fast, could carry drop tanks and had the range to follow the bombers deep into German airspace, but it still had limits. Its British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, produced under license by Packard in the United States, was powerful, but not yet at its peak. The fuel available, known as 100-octane aviation gasoline, was holding it back. Octane was the measure of resistance to engine knock, the uncontrolled detonation that could destroy an engine under high pressure. The higher the octane, the more compression and boost the engine could handle. In theory, a higher octane fuel meant more power, higher speeds, and greater altitude performance. But pushing octane beyond 100 was considered almost impossible. Chemists knew that small improvements could take years of experimentation. Engineers at Wright Field, the U.S. Army Air Force's testing center in Ohio, had already reached the practical limits of standard gasoline refining. The war, however, had no patience for limits. By late 1943, the Allies were in a race not just for airframes, but for the chemistry that made them fly. On both sides of the Atlantic, a new kind of industrial science had taken root: fuel research. Petroleum engineers, chemists, and refinery specialists, many of whom had never seen an aircraft up close, suddenly found themselves critical to the war effort. Among them was a French-born engineer named Eugene Houdry, who had fled to America years earlier. His invention, the catalytic cracking process, had revolutionized how crude oil was refined. It allowed the production of lighter, more volatile fractions that could be blended into high-performance fuel. Without it, the Allies could not have produced the quantities of high-octane gasoline the air war demanded. Meanwhile, the British were conducting their own experiments with fuel chemistry at laboratories like Thornton Research Centre in Cheshire. They knew from experience, especially the Battle of Britain, that better fuel meant better performance. Their 100-octane blend had already given RAF Spitfires a crucial advantage over German fighters in 1940, when most of the Luftwaffe still relied on 87-octane fuel. That lesson wasn't forgotten. By 1944, the goal was even bolder: to create a blend that could push octane far beyond 100 to 130, even 150. But what did 150 octane actually mean? It wasn't a true octane number in the conventional sense. Engineers used a scale extended with reference compounds that allowed for performance ratings above 100. When an engine ran on such fuel, it behaved as though it had gasoline capable of resisting detonation at levels once thought impossible. In practice, this meant pilots could increase manifold pressure and boost without the engine knocking itself apart. More power, more thrust, and longer life, the trifecta every fighter pilot dreamed of. In the Pacific, this kind of innovation had already saved lives. Charles Lindbergh, now serving as a civilian consultant, had taught P-38 Lightning pilots how to extend their range using more efficient engine settings, a controversial method that had broken the rules but worked. In Europe, similar thinking was taking shape. Engineers believed they could achieve both power and endurance through chemistry rather than technique. The problem was the clock. By 1944, the Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, and every logistical system, from tanks to trucks to planes, depended on fuel. Refinery capacity was stretched thin. Introducing a new experimental grade of gasoline into wartime logistics carried enormous risk. If it failed, entire operations could grind to a halt. Yet the pressure to gain air superiority was immense. The Luftwaffe was bloodied but far from beaten. Their new fighters, the Bf-109G and Fw-190A, were formidable, and the first jet-powered Me-262s were entering service. If Germany could maintain control of the skies, the invasion fleet might never reach France. Every advantage mattered. That's when American and British petroleum scientists began pushing their experimental fuel to frontline units for testing. It arrived in barrels marked 150 grade, dyed purple to distinguish it from standard fuel. It wasn't officially sanctioned for combat use yet, but with war in full swing, field trials often blurred into real missions. Pilots who tested it reported astonishing results. Engines ran smoother at high boost, throttle response improved, aircraft could climb faster, accelerate harder, and sustain combat power longer before overheating. It was like flying a different machine, one pilot recalled. Same plane, same engine, but she came alive. What they were experiencing was the effect of tetraethyl lid, a potent anti-knock additive that allowed combustion pressures far higher than ever before. Its inclusion, along with carefully balanced aromatic hydrocarbons and refinery distillates, pushed engine performance into uncharted territory. But with every advantage came a risk. Tetraethyl lead was toxic and difficult to handle. The new blends required strict temperature control and exact mixing ratios. A contaminated batch could destroy engines or poison ground crews. For this reason, much of the development was kept under tight military supervision. At Wright Field, engineers ran around-the-clock tests to verify stability, energy density, and safety. Across the Atlantic, the Air Ministry coordinated with British refineries and the U.S. Petroleum Administration to synchronize production. The stakes were enormous. If successful, this would be the first time in history that chemical engineering, not airframe design, changed the outcome of a major air campaign. Meanwhile, Germany faced its own crisis. Allied bombing had crippled the Reich's oil supply. Synthetic fuel plants, which converted coal into liquid fuel through the Fischer-Tropsch process, were under constant attack. The Luftwaffe's high-performance fighters ran on fuel with lower octane ratings and poorer stability. As a result, German engines had to run at reduced boost pressures to avoid detonation, robbing them of speed and climb rate. Even the famed Daimler-Benz engines in the Bf-109 could no longer reach their pre-war potential. The fuel war, silent, unseen, was becoming decisive. By early June 1944, Allied bombers and fighters were consuming millions of gallons of aviation fuel every week. Supply lines stretched from Texas and Louisiana refineries to British depots, then across the channel to forward airfields in Normandy. Among the countless tankers and drums was the new purple-dyed fuel, still technically experimental but already proving its worth. The U.S. 8th and 9th Air Forces began limited use with selected P-51 groups. At first, they noticed it only in the numbers. Slightly longer range, better throttle response at high altitude, fewer engine failures. But in combat, those numbers meant everything. A few knots faster in a chase could mean the difference between life and death. A few hundred feet more climb per minute could turn a defensive scramble into a clean escape. For the bomber crews limping home from targets like Berlin and Leipzig, the difference between being escorted or abandoned was measured not in miles, but in fuel chemistry. Still, to the average pilot, the change was invisible. They knew their engines were running stronger, but few understood why. "We just flew what they gave us," one Mustang veteran later recalled. "Nobody told us it was new fuel. All we knew was the plane was damn near perfect." Behind that perfection lay an invisible network of chemists, refinery workers, and engineers whose names would never appear on mission reports. They were the hidden allies of the air war, their work measured not in dogfights won, but in miles flown and engines that didn't fail. Yet even as the P-51 became the symbol of Allied air dominance, the full potential of the new fuel had not yet been unleashed. Engineers at Wright Field and Rolls-Royce were still fine-tuning manifold pressures and ignition timings to match the blend's properties. Field reports were pouring in, and results were promising. What remained was to prove beyond doubt that 150-octane gasoline could be safely used across entire combat wings without damaging the engines or compromising logistics. It was a gamble, but one the Allies could no longer afford not to take. As summer advanced, the war in the air was reaching a breaking point. The Luftwaffe was fighting on fumes, its aces grounded by shortages, its replacement pilots barely trained. The Allies, by contrast, were flooding Europe with machines that seemed to grow stronger every month. Beneath that momentum was a simple truth: the battle for air supremacy had become a battle of chemistry. The next phase, the introduction of 150-octane fuel on a massive scale, would test whether science alone could change the outcome of a global war. And so, on a warm morning in July 1944, at an airfield somewhere in East Anglia, a ground crew rolled a barrel marked with a single stenciled line: 150 grade, do not mix. The purple fuel inside shimmered in the sunlight as it flowed into a Mustang's wing tank. The pilot, unaware of the scientific revolution coursing into his aircraft, simply checked his gauges, throttled forward, and took to the sky. What happened next would convince even the most skeptical commanders that fuel, not just firepower, could win a war. July 1944. The airfields of East Anglia were busy from dawn till dusk. Thunderheads gathered over the flat English countryside as hundreds of P-51 Mustangs idled along the perimeter tracks, their propellers flickering in the low morning light. Mechanics moved fast between them, checking plugs, tightening cowlings, and refilling tanks with a liquid that shimmered faintly violet in the sunlight. The label on each drum was blunt: 150 grade aviation fuel, restricted use. Few outside the engineering corps knew what that meant, but those who did understood that history was being poured into those wings. The innovation was as simple as it was radical: a new kind of gasoline that changed what an aircraft engine could do. At its heart lay a scientific breakthrough that had begun years earlier, far from the noise of battle. Back in 1938, a small group of chemists and fuel technologists working in American and British laboratories had been chasing the same problem: how to make fuel withstand higher compression without detonating. They experimented with aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene, which resisted pre-ignition far better than straight-chain hydrocarbons. But these blends were unstable and hard to refine. The war forced them to push harder. By 1942, Allied refineries were experimenting with complex blends of isooctane benzene derivatives and lead additives, seeking a mix that would stay stable under heat and pressure. The hero of this invisible war was tetraethyl lead (TEL), discovered before the war but now used on an unprecedented scale. By adding just 1 part in 1,000 to gasoline, it dramatically raised the detonation threshold. TEL allowed engines to run at far higher boost pressures without knocking, unleashing enormous power from the same machinery, but handling it was dangerous. Ground crews wore gloves and masks. Spills were treated like chemical incidents. Even so, the military pressed ahead. For the engineers at Wright Field and the Air Ministry's laboratories, victory depended on chemistry as much as courage. The idea of 150-octane fuel emerged from these experiments. On paper, octane stopped at 100, the reference point based on isooctane's anti-knock properties. But engineers extended the scale using performance numbers, artificial equivalents that measured how fuels behaved under extreme load. A 130-grade fuel didn't literally have 130-octane molecules. It simply performed as though it did. The top of that extended scale was 150, the pinnacle of stability and power. When the first test batches of grade 150 fuel arrived at Wright Field in late 1943, they were met with skepticism. Some engineers doubted it could be safely used in combat engines. It contained higher aromatic content and more lead than any previous blend. There were fears it might corrode valves, foul spark plugs, or cause catastrophic failures under sustained power. Engines are like men, one Packard technician remarked. Push them too hard, they break. Yet the Air Technical Service Command authorized limited bench tests. The results stunned everyone. Engines that produced 1,450 horsepower on 100-octane fuel suddenly delivered 1,720 with no significant rise in temperature or wear. Cylinder heads ran cooler, and detonation, the constant enemy of high-performance flight, virtually disappeared. What had seemed alchemy was now measurable science. Still, no one wanted to risk combat aircraft on unproven chemistry. The Air Ministry suggested using the new fuel only for high-altitude interceptors like the Spitfire Mk9, which suffered power loss in thin air. Meanwhile, in America, General Jimmy Doolittle, the same man who had led the 1942 Tokyo raid, was convinced that this innovation could change everything. Doolittle, a trained aeronautical engineer, had long believed that fuel technology was as decisive as aircraft design. He personally championed the distribution of higher octane fuel for frontline fighters, arguing that power is the ultimate defense. Under his influence, the U.S. 8th Air Force began quiet trials with P-51 groups operating out of Debden and Bodney. The results were almost immediate. One test pilot, Captain John V. Godfrey, wrote in his logbook, took off with 150 fuel, climbed to 25,000 feet, power steady, no knock, boosted to 72 inches, engine held, felt like a new ship. That single note would later be cited in Wright Field's internal reports as the first confirmed operational test of 150-grade gasoline in the European theater. Soon, other squadrons began reporting similar outcomes. Engines tolerated boost levels up to 75 inches of mercury, a dangerous figure under normal conditions without pre-ignition. Pilots described acceleration like a hand at your back. Climb rates increased by several hundred feet per minute. Speed tests reached 440 to 448 miles per hour, pushing the P-51's performance beyond anything achieved before. Not everyone was convinced. Old habits and wartime caution died hard. Maintenance officers worried about engine wear and fuel system contamination. The extra lead deposits required new cleaning schedules, spark plugs had to be changed more frequently. Some commanders even refused to authorize its use, fearing a single bad batch could ground entire wings. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group, was among the skeptics. "Our planes are flying fine as they are," he said during one heated briefing. "The last thing we need is a lab experiment in the middle of a war." But the war wasn't waiting. The Luftwaffe's latest FW-190D9, with its Junkers Jumo 213 engine, was fast, armed with 20 cannons and deadly in a dive. The Me-109G10 could climb like a rocket and hit 440 mph on emergency power. In response, the Allies needed every edge they could get. The engineers pressed their case. The P-51's Merlin engine, designed to handle higher compression, could safely exploit the new fuel. Tests had shown no increase in bearing wear or piston failure after 50-hour endurance runs. More importantly, the increased range and climb rate could mean survival for hundreds of bomber crews. At the Petroleum Warfare Department in London, scientists from Shell, Esso, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company met with military liaisons to finalize specifications for mass production. The purple dye was added as a safety measure to distinguish it from 100-grade stockpiles and to make leaks visible in daylight. Refining methods were shared between American and British plants, particularly those at Abadan and Baton Rouge. The U.S. Petroleum Administration, under Harold Ickes, declared the project a priority resource. By mid-July 1944, over 30 million gallons of grade 150 had been produced and shipped to depots across southern England. The fuel war had become a logistical operation of staggering scale. But behind the numbers were human reactions, the pilots who felt the change firsthand. Lieutenant William Tex Hill of the 354th Fighter Group remembered the first time he opened the throttle with 150 grade in his tanks. "You could feel it like a kick in the ribs, the nose lifted quicker, she climbed smoother. We didn't know what they'd done, but we liked it." Others noticed the smell, a slightly sweeter odor, the trace of benzene compounds in the blend. Ground crews joked about the perfume that kills Nazis. Soon word spread, squadrons that had once barely kept pace with enemy fighters were now outclimbing and outrunning them. The difference, though measured in seconds, was everything in combat. "You only needed an extra 10 seconds of full power to win," recalled pilot Don Gentile. "That's what the new fuel gave us." For the scientists who had labored in obscurity, these stories were vindication. At Wright Field, reports began to flood in. Engine knock virtually eliminated. Takeoff boost increased safely to 70 inches. Fuel economy improved by nearly 10% at cruise settings. One internal memo dated August 2, 1944, noted, "Operational introduction of grade 150 fuel has demonstrated conclusive superiority in both endurance and speed at all combat altitudes. Recommend full-scale deployment." Yet with every success came a new challenge. Lead deposits built up on exhaust valves and spark plugs, requiring more frequent maintenance. The aromatic content of the fuel caused some rubber seals to degrade, leading to leaks. Supply chains struggled to segregate the purple-dyed fuel from standard grades. Even a small mix could alter combustion properties. Logistics officers scrambled to mark storage tanks, pipelines, and aircraft clearly to prevent cross-contamination. These were the growing pains of a revolution moving faster than anyone had planned. Across the channel, the Germans were noticing. Interrogations of captured Luftwaffe pilots revealed confusion about Allied aircraft suddenly flying faster and higher. "The Mustangs have changed," one pilot told intelligence officers. They no longer fall behind in climb. It is as though they have new engines. The reality that their engines were unchanged, only their fuel transformed, was something the Reich scientists would soon confirm through captured samples. In August 1944, a Luftwaffe technical unit recovered several Allied jerry cans from a downed P-51. The contents were analyzed at a fuel research station near Augsburg. The report, later captured after the war, noted high lead content, purple coloration, increased aromatic fraction, estimated performance number 150. The Germans were stunned. Their own synthetic aviation fuels rarely exceeded 95 octane. Attempts to raise performance with benzene additives had failed due to shortages and refinery damage. With their hydrogenation plants in Luna and Politz under constant bombardment, Germany had no way to match the Allies' new blend. The chemists concluded grimly that the enemy possesses an aviation fuel unattainable with current resources. In a war measured in inches of manifold pressure and fractions of horsepower, that conclusion was devastating. The Luftwaffe's once superior engines were now handicapped by their own supply lines. Every Me-109 and FW-190 in the sky faced opponents running on fuel that burned hotter, cleaner, and longer. The result would soon show itself in the skies over France and Germany. Meanwhile, at Wright Field, test pilots continued to push the boundaries. One of them, Major Fred Borsodi, described a flight that would later be cited in post-war technical manuals. Climb to 30,000 feet, throttle 72 inches, mixture autoline, fuel grade 150, speed 446 mph indicated. No detonation detected, engine temp nominal. Engineers reviewing the data realized they had reached a new performance plateau without redesigning a single part. The Mustang, already the most capable long-range escort fighter of the war, had just gained another dimension, one the enemy could neither see nor counter. Even the bombers began to benefit. Modified versions of 150-grade fuel were tested in B-24s and B-17s to improve climb rates during takeoff with heavy payloads. It was risky. Their engines weren't built for sustained high boost, but limited trials showed promise. The real payoff, however, remained with the fighters. The P-51D, the definitive Mustang variant, could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin, fight the Luftwaffe over their own airfields, and return with enough reserve fuel to spare. What had once been a one-way gamble became routine. Still, acceptance was far from universal. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory questioned whether the new fuel justified the logistical headaches. He warned that dependence on exotic blends could cripple operations if supply faltered. Others worried about cost. The refining process for 150-grade gasoline required more crude input and special catalysts, straining petroleum reserves. There were debates in London and Washington over whether the performance gains truly outweighed the risks. Yet, as the summer air war intensified, the question was becoming irrelevant. The fuel was already in use, and it was working. In early September 1944, an intelligence report from the German Air Ministry noted a marked improvement in the speed and climb characteristics of P-51 and Spitfire aircraft. By then, the Luftwaffe's own situation was dire. Fighter losses had reached catastrophic levels. Supply convoys were crippled by Allied bombing, pilots flew on reduced training hours, aviation fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The contrast was cruel. While German pilots struggled to coax one more sortie from their underpowered engines, Allied airmen were taking off with full tanks of the most advanced gasoline the world had ever produced. One of the few surviving Luftwaffe aces, Günther Rall, later recalled his first encounter with Mustangs running 150 fuel. They were faster in level flight. Before we could break away in a dive, now they stayed with us. Something had changed. For the Allies, that something was proof that chemistry could be as decisive as courage. Still, the new fuel was not yet officially standard. The British Air Ministry continued to classify it as operational trial. Reports from maintenance crews were being collected, analyzed, and debated. There was one final hurdle to prove that large-scale use would not damage the Merlin engines over time. The data was incomplete. The commanders demanded certainty. So the next step was inevitable. Wright Field would conduct full-scale endurance trials under combat conditions, 25 aircraft, flown hard, at maximum boost for hours on end. If the engines survived, grade 150 would become the new standard for Allied fighters in Europe. The barrels were already waiting, glinting purple under the hangar lights. September 1944. Europe was burning from the skies. Allied bombers filled the dawn air over Belgium and the Netherlands, their silver wings catching the first light as they formed tight box formations bound for Germany. The air war that had once seemed unwinnable was now turning decisively in the Allies' favor. The reason wasn't immediately visible: no new fighter design, no secret radar breakthrough. The change ran through fuel lines, not fuselages. Inside every Packard-built Merlin engine roared a volatile purple mixture, the 150-octane gasoline that was transforming the P-51 Mustang from a long-range escort into a weapon of dominance. At Wright Field, endurance trials had already begun. 25 Merlin engines were run continuously at 75 inches of manifold pressure, fueled exclusively by grade 150 gasoline. The engineers watched cylinder temperatures, oil pressures, and detonation patterns with clinical precision. The results astonished even the skeptics. After 100 hours of continuous operation, no significant wear was detected beyond normal limits. Spark plug fouling was manageable, valve damage negligible. The test report, stamped confidential October 1944, concluded, grade 150 gasoline is suitable for unrestricted operational use in Packard 51650 engines under combat conditions. With that single signature, an invisible barrier fell. The order went out in late September. The 8th and 9th Air Forces were authorized to use grade 150 fuel for all P-51D operations in the European theater. From that point on, the Allies' most advanced fighter would be flying at its full potential. The first missions using the new fuel came during Operation Market Garden, the ill-fated airborne assault across the Netherlands. As paratroopers dropped over Arnhem and Nijmegen, the P-51 groups of the 354th and 356th Fighter Groups provided escort and air cover. Their job was to protect C-47 transports and gliders from Luftwaffe interceptors. On September 18, over Eindhoven, a group of German FW-190s dove on the transport stream. The P-51s responded immediately, climbing from 12,000 to 20,000 feet in under 2 minutes, a feat nearly impossible with standard fuel. Lieutenant Clarence Bud Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group later recalled, "We were running 72 inches of boost, unheard of before. When you kicked the throttle, she went vertical." The Germans never saw that coming. That day, the Luftwaffe lost 17 aircraft. The Allied transports lost only 3. Pilots credited the improved climb and sustained power, both direct results of the new fuel. One after-action report from the 354th noted, engines ran cooler under high boost, fuel consumption normal, performance markedly superior. Recommend permanent adoption. For the Luftwaffe, the change was devastating. Their Bf-109GS and FW-190s were already struggling to reach high altitude quickly enough to intercept bombers. Now even their dives, once a reliable escape, were matched. German pilots found themselves unable to disengage. "The Mustangs seemed glued to us," wrote Oberleutnant Helmut Lipford in his diary. "We would dive, they would dive. We would climb, they would climb. I thought perhaps they had new engines." Later I learned it was only their fuel. By October 1944, the Allies were striking deep into Germany with near impunity. The 8th Air Force's B-17 and B-24 formations, escorted by Mustangs running 150 octane, hit oil refineries at Merseburg, Luna, and Politz, the heart of Germany's synthetic fuel network. These refineries were the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe, producing over 90% of its aviation gasoline. Now they burned day and night. American bombers dropped 7,000 tons of explosives on the Luna complex alone, crippling Germany's ability to refine fuel. It was a bitter irony. The same element that had given the Allies supremacy, high-octane gasoline, was now destroying the enemy's last supply of it. The effect on Luftwaffe operations was catastrophic. Intelligence reports from October recorded that frontline German fighter units were receiving less than 30% of their required fuel. Training hours were cut to a few minutes per sortie. Experienced pilots were grounded to conserve reserves. Even the elite Jagdgeschwader 52, once home to Erich Hartmann and Günther Rall, could no longer mount full-strength sorties. The surviving German aircraft had to rely on 87-octane synthetic blends that degraded rapidly and caused detonation at altitude. One Luftwaffe technical bulletin from November admitted that engine life expectancy has fallen below 20 hours due to fuel instability. Meanwhile, Allied engineers kept pushing. Wright Field issued a new operational guideline allowing the Merlin engine to run at 75 inches of mercury boost using 150-grade fuel in emergency power for up to 5 minutes. This war emergency power mode gave a 15% increase in speed and climb rate, just enough to catch or escape almost any aircraft in the sky. In practice, pilots often stretched that limit, running full power for up to 10 minutes in combat. The Merlin took the abuse without complaint. The chemistry held. As the air war intensified, combat reports began to tell a new story, one of domination rather than survival. On November 2, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its largest bombing raid of the war, over 1,100 bombers and 900 fighters targeting oil and rail facilities near Merseburg and Leipzig. Luftwaffe resistance was fierce, 300 fighters scrambled to intercept. But this time, the outcome was lopsided. Allied losses totaled 40 bombers and 13 fighters. The Germans lost 120 aircraft, many shot down by P-51s before they could reach the bombers. The mission debriefing cited a significant detail: extended combat at 25,000 feet sustained by Mustang squadrons using 150 octane fuel without incident. No engine failures reported under maximum boost. General Carl Spaatz, head of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, took notice. "Gentlemen," he told his staff, "this is the turning point. We own the air." His statement was not hyperbole. In just 2 months, Luftwaffe aircraft losses had surpassed their replacement rate threefold. The German High Command began transferring fighter units from the Eastern Front to defend the homeland, weakening their resistance against the advancing Red Army. Every cause and effect chain traced back to the same quiet innovation: a fuel that let Allied aircraft stay longer, fly farther, and fight harder. The British Royal Air Force joined the transformation soon after. In November, selected Spitfire Mk-XIV squadrons were authorized to use 150 octane fuel for operations over the Channel and northern France. With the new blend, the Griffin-powered Spitfires could run at plus 25 pounds boost pressure, up from plus 18, increasing top speed to over 450 mph. RAF test pilot Geoffrey Quill called it the most dramatic leap in performance since the war began. Combat units soon verified it. During a 5-1 flying bomb interception over southern England, squadron leader Johnny Johnson recorded that the new fuel gave us climb and acceleration we'd never seen before. We could run them down before they reached London. From the refineries to the front lines, the success of 150 octane gasoline was rewriting the logistics of modern war. Each gallon carried more energy, allowing aircraft to fly further or carry heavier payloads. The new blend also burned cleaner at cruise, extending the range of escort missions by nearly 100 miles. For the bomber crews who had once watched their escorts peel away over Belgium, that difference meant survival. "They stayed with us all the way in," recalled B-17 pilot LT Jack Warren after a raid on Berlin. "We looked out the windows and saw Mustangs circling even as we turned for home. That was new, that was everything." Behind these victories lay a vast industrial operation. Producing 150-grade fuel required enormous quantities of aromatic hydrocarbons, primarily toluene, extracted through catalytic cracking, the very process pioneered by Eugene Houdry. His innovation allowed refineries to break down heavy crude into lighter, more energy-dense fractions, effectively multiplying output. In 1944 alone, U.S. refineries produced over 53 million gallons of high-performance aviation gasoline, nearly half of which went to European operations. Each gallon carried within it years of accumulated chemical knowledge and the labor of thousands of refinery workers who would never see a cockpit. But the war was not finished adapting. Germany still possessed one trump card: the jet fighter. By late 1944, the Messerschmitt Me-262 was entering combat, a sleek twin-engine machine capable of over 500 mph. On paper, it could outrun any piston-engine fighter alive. The Allies knew this and feared it. If deployed in numbers, the 262 could threaten the entire bomber offensive. Yet even this technological marvel was constrained by fuel. Its Jumo 4 engines demanded high-quality kerosene refined from oil Germany no longer controlled. Instead, they ran on low-grade synthetic blends that burned hot and unstable, shortening engine life to less than 25 flight hours. Pilots described the engines as time bombs. Meanwhile, Allied P-51s, running on 150-grade gasoline, simply loitered near German airfields and caught jets during takeoff or landing when they were most vulnerable. In one such encounter near Darmstadt on November 26, 1944, a flight of 4 P-51DS from the 339th Fighter Group intercepted Me-262s attempting to climb after bombing runs. The Mustangs used their superior acceleration to catch the jets before they could level off. In the ensuing dogfight, 3 jets were destroyed. The combat report noted, "Performance consistent with aircraft operating at 75-inch boost, 150-grade fuel. Power remained steady, pursuit speed estimated 445 mph." The psychological shift was profound. Only months earlier, Allied pilots had dreaded German attacks. Now they hunted. The Luftwaffe's daylight defense collapsed by winter. By December 1944, the Germans had fewer than 500 operational fighters across all of Western Europe. The Allies had over 10,000. Yet the story of 150-octane fuel was not just about speed, it was about reach. During the Ardennes offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, this mattered more than ever. As Hitler launched his surprise counterattack through the frozen forests of Belgium, Allied ground forces suddenly faced heavy pressure. Low clouds and snow grounded most aircraft, but when the weather cleared on December 23, the sky filled with the roar of engines. P-51 Mustangs, operating at their maximum range, provided air cover and ground attack support in near-constant waves. With 150-octane fuel, they could loiter longer, strafing German convoys and armor columns that relied on exposed roads. A captured Wehrmacht report later described the effect. Movement by day became impossible. Allied fighters were everywhere. General Eisenhower himself credited air superiority as the decisive factor that broke the German offensive. And behind that superiority was logistics, the endless flow of purple-dyed fuel from British docks to forward depots. The Allies were fighting not just with courage but with chemistry. Still, success carried new complications. The higher boost pressures made maintenance demanding. Engines required meticulous care to prevent fouling. Ground crews worked through the night scraping lead deposits from spark plugs and cleaning intake valves. Refueling operations had to segregate tanks of 100 and 150 grade gasoline to avoid contamination. It was like feeding a racehorse, recalled crew chief SGT.